Welcome to the lesson on planning. Planning is very important for any application you build. It's one of those things that often gets overlooked, but I really want to make sure I focus on this because the better I plan out my application now, the easier it will be and the less bugs I will have, the less areas I'll work myself into a corner down the road. And so the more time I spend here, the better off my application will be. And so we're going to use my framework, the WOULD framework, WOULD, which is an acronym for the 5 steps that you need to do in any planning session. So let's start right off the bat with W. W is walk through it. And so the walk through it step really is just get an overview of what you need to do with this application. Just understand the requirements. So this application is just a small application that'll be used to track hours spent working for a client, the billables associated with those hours, and the payments made for those hours. So essentially, this is just a little application that a consultant would use or someone who has to do billable work. And they're just going to track their hours using this application and then track who those hours are for and bill those hours and also get payments for those hours. Okay? So it's a little application. That's the goal of the application. O is open up the requirements. What that means is whenever you get a set of requirements from somebody, unless it's a very, very rare case, you're going to get incomplete requirements because people assume that you know what they're thinking about. And that's a bad place to be because what you think about an application may be totally different than what the person who gave it to you is thinking about that same application. So this is where you get to the opportunity to kind of shine a flashlight in those dark areas. Talk it through with the owner, the person who's asking for the application. Make sure you understand what they're looking for. Now, if you're the person who is also the owner, the person who's requesting the application, then it's a little bit easier. But still, you need to look at the application objectively because there will be things that you kind of gloss over. And if you don't think about them specifically, when you get to those spots, you'll be confused, lost, or in a corner that you don't want to be in. Okay? So in our case, it's a small application. There's not a lot to it, but there are some things we need to talk about. First of all, what's the user interface? That's very important. Now, what I am envisioning is the idea that this will be running on the user's computer and maybe even have a little timer that kind of tracks the hours in real time. So you can say, start timer, I'm working for this client. And then when you're done, you have to hit stop timer and it calculates this is how many hours you worked for that client. And then you fill in the rest and hit submit and you're good to go. So that means web is probably out the window. It's probably not something we're going to use. So I've decided that WPF is probably the best option for our front end. But since we're also looking to get this application out the door quickly and we're trying to make it a simple application, we're not going to use MVVM. Okay? MVVM is one of my favorite things to use with WPF. I use Caliburn Micro for that, and I love it. But that's not to say that every application gets MVVM. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's typically for larger applications or certain data-heavy applications. And while our application will be somewhat data-heavy, we're going to go ahead and say no to the complexity of MVVM. Now, the whole reason we're building this application really is because we want to make sure we understand how SQLite works in a real-world environment. So we're going to be using a SQLite backend. That's just one of those things that it works really well for this application. This application really fits with the idea of having this portable database. And so that's what we're going to do. And it will give us some good testing. It's also going to give us some good experience in WPF and a few other areas. But the real purpose behind this was to use SQLite in a real-world environment. Okay, it's getting as small as possible. And by that, I mean the user interface. So we don't want this to be a full screen app. We want this to be something where it could potentially just sit in the corner and stay sitting there. So we wanted to kind of slim down our forms, make them small, and just what they need to in order to function. And then finally, and this is kind of overlooked sometimes, but we want this to be simple. And by that, I mean, we don't want this complex, in-depth application that's so hard to maintain, and it takes so long to get out the door. Instead, this is a small application we're building to get it out the door quickly, to get something working. And so we want it to be as simple as possible so that it's quick to build. All right, so that covers O. Let's go on to the user interface design. Now, what I did was pretty common for me. I designed this on my whiteboard. Portion of it is I try to make it so that the first thing you see, the main form, is what you do most of your work on. This is the central place you do all your work, because that way you're not having to click off this form to go to where you're actually working. Because we want to cut down on those clicks. Okay, we want the user to just get in and use it. That makes them so much happier than having to get in and do work in order to do work, okay? You don't want them to dig through things in order to be able to use your application. So the main form is where we have a client dropdown. That's a list of clients that we can bill. And then there's the hours box, which is just a text box. We can put a number in, but it also has this button called Start Timer. And that'll be a timer that runs, and when you hit start timer, it's going to change the button and say stop timer. And when they hit stop timer, it's going to calculate how many minutes you worked for that client and convert it over to hours. So my thought is that our unit of measurement is hours, and we will do potentially partial hours. Okay, so you can have a quarter of an hour, half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, or a full hour. Okay, and then finally, whenever you do work, you should probably say what you are doing during that time. So have a title, which is just the short description of what you're doing, and then a description could be additional information you want to give about what you were doing. And the description is optional, because otherwise it'll just have an empty string there. And then the submit button, that's it. Now, on that main form, you also have at the very top what is not the greatest drawing there, but that's a menu system. So it's going to have file, which just has exit. It's going to have clients, which is going to go to the client form. And this may even be buttons. We don't necessarily have to have a menu, just something simple to say, okay, here's how you go to the different sections. So payments would take us right to adding or editing payments or seeing the payments. And work takes us to the work we've done. And then finally, the help menu would probably just have an about screen. Okay, so that's the main form. Then we have the client form, and some of these forms are really, really simple. So I'm just kind of calling out the important bits. Okay, so clients, my thought would be you have a drop down of all the clients we currently have, and then we have an edit button. So you select a client and you hit edit, and down below where those lines are, that would fill in all the different data points we have about a client, and they can edit that, and then there'd be a submit button or a save button there. But then also you can have a new button so that we can create a new client and have all the fields. We can fill them in and then hit submit, and it would add that to the drop down, and of course then add it on the main screen as well. Payments, kind of similar. We have a client drop down, and then we have a list of all the payments that have been made and when, and then next to each one would be an edit button in case we wanted to edit them. That'd probably be a pretty uncommon thing to do, and maybe we don't even add it for version 1, but I was thinking maybe we could add that later, possibly. But then down at the bottom would be an add button, which would allow us to add new payment. I was thinking we need a defaults page. So this is where we have the defaults for any work that's done or any new client. So, this would be things like, how we round up hours. Do we round up hours? Do we do pre-billing, which would be we bill them first and then do the work? Or do we do the work and then bill them for the hours we worked? And stuff like that. So that would be kind of the defaults for us. And then that would get applied to a client unless we specified something different. Okay, so that'd just be, it'd fill in that for the client instead of us having to fill it in every time. What I don't have shown here is the actual work list, but that's really simple. It's just a list of all the things that we've done, that we've logged. And then also the about screen, which is just essentially just a little thing that says, here's who created it. Okay. So, but that's the user interface design. Really simple. I didn't go crazy trying to, draw out where everything necessary will be, or making sure that everything, looks just right. It was just trying to communicate the concepts of these are the things that I'm going to want to have on a form, and this is roughly how it's going to look. And then as we get into the actual form design, we can take these under advisement, and it'll give us a good starting point. But then we can make it, maybe fit better with how we're thinking, or make it look a little better depending on, on how we how it actually looks when we start putting it into WPF. Okay, so that's our user interface design. Logic design, that's the L. So the logic design is where we spend a little bit of time at looking over the big chunks of our application that we're going to have to know how to do in logic. Okay, so these are the things where it's a little trickier than just some variables, classes, properties, and methods. These are things where it may take a little bit of extra work, or it's a little bit more complicated, or it might even take a third-party library. Okay, so the logic design, there's not a lot here because we're really concentrating on SQLite. And so that's the big deal where we're focusing, is that little database. So we're not going to do a ton of flashy stuff here, but one of the things I thought of that would be really nice is to have the ability to minimize to a system tray. And so we'll see if we can put that into place. Next, we're going to have the SQLite database deploy with the application. So it's just going to go with the deployment process, which brings us to how we're going to deploy, which is we're just going to do a copy and paste. We're going to take what's in the bin folder and just copy and paste that to wherever we need to. We can zip it up and send it to wherever we need to, because we'll have an exe, we'll have our DLL, and we'll have our database. WPF, we're going to use parent-child forms. That way we can keep the menu in the same place. We can keep the layout the same. The form doesn't go, resizing, having pop-ups and all the rest. And finally, we're going to probably have a menu bar to get between the different forms. Okay, so that's the basic design of our application, the logic design. These are the big things that, as I'm looking at this list, if I had any question about how to do these things, what I would do is I would build a sample application, a really small one, that just focuses on, okay, how do I minimize a WPF application to the system tray? And just that. And then I do another one that's just how do I deploy SQLite with the application if I had any questions. Same with the menu bar, the parent-child forms, all of these. I create little applications to make sure I understood how these things worked. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to try and do it for the first time in your main application and cause problems. Because then you're starting to pull code out, and if you're not careful, you orphan some code. And if you do that, then you may introduce bugs later on because you forgot to take a line of code out or whatever. So just make sure that you understand these logic pieces before you try and use them for the first time in your production application. All right, finally, the database design, the D in the Wood framework. So the database design is what data do we need to store in what tables, okay? So this then really closely relates to what models will I need. Now, I say closely because there will be some differences in our models depending on what we need in the UI, and that's okay. The thing that people often get hung up on is the idea that your model has to directly reflect what's in the table, and that's not true. You can have multiple models to reflect some of what's in each table. Okay, so you can have, against the same table, 5, 6, 8, 10 models that all have different jobs, and that's okay. And that's something that usually, if you come from an entity framework background, you're a little more uptight about that because it's a one-to-one relationship sometimes. And that's not what we want to do. We want to be a little more free in this. But so this is more of our database design. So our SQLite database will probably have these tables. Now I come up with 4. We may have to add more if we say, okay, yep, we're missing something. But I think these 4 will probably cover it. So the first one is the client table. So the client, now each of these has an ID, and I didn't list that. I was just listing the important fields that I thought we'd need. It'll probably also have some date time fields that are not here as well. So we have the client, and the client has a name, an hourly rate. So this is how much we charge them per hour. They have an email address. Pre-bill is a Boolean. So the idea here with pre-bill was the idea that that some customers or some consultants might want to bill up front. And this is what I do. So if a customer comes to me and says, I want to consult with you, what I do is say, okay, how many hours would you like to buy? And they buy a block of hours, and then I do work up to that many hours. Okay? And if they want more hours beyond that, they have to buy a block up front. So that way, I'm never stuck in this case of tracking down users or customers and saying, you owe me. This way, they pay up front. So that's what pre-bill would be. Now, other consultants say, no, what I do is I just bill them after a certain number of hours, and I give them 30 days of pay. So that would be pre-bill off or pre-bill false. Okay? So it has cutoff. So you may want to cut your client off on either side. So if it's pre-billing, where they're buying a block of hours, what I do is I cut off at 0. So once you hit 0, you don't get any more work from me until you buy another block of hours. On the other side of it, maybe you don't do that. Maybe you bill the customer for hours worked, but you say, you know what? We can't have more than 30 hours of outstanding work that have not yet been paid. And so the cutoff would be 30 hours. So if you hit 30 hours that have not been paid, then that's when we cut you off. Okay, so it works either way. And then minimum hours is if you're going, some consultants will say, you know, if I'm going to do any work for you, that's at least 2 hours work. So if I do 15 minutes of work, that's 2 hours. If I do an hour and a half, it's still 2 hours. If I do 4 hours, it's only 4 hours. But there's a minimum there. Others don't. Others say, you know what? No, I'll do 15 minutes of work and bill it as 15 minutes of work. That's what I do. So, and then billing increments. So some consultants say, I round to the nearest hour. So if I do 5 minutes of work, they may round up. They'll round up to an hour. Where if they do an hour and 5 minutes of work, that's 2 hours. Others say they round at 15 minutes. So if I do 1 minute's worth of work, that's 15 minutes. If I do 20 minutes of work, that's actually 30 minutes. And if I do, 50 minutes of work, that's an hour. Because they round up to the nearest 15 minutes. So that would determine the increments you do. I would say the minimum would be 15-minute increments. Since we're recording an hour, that's really convenient because now it's 0.25 hours, 0.5 hours, 0.75 hours, and an hour. That's 15-minute increments. Where maybe some others would say, I do half-hour increments, which is 0.5 hours. Others may say it's a full hour or 2 hours or something like that. So, and then round up after X minutes. This field says, when do you round up? Now, some people say, well, if we're doing 15-minute increments, then I round up after, 7 minutes. But others say, no, I round up after the first minute. So if I just spend 1 minute, that's 15 minutes. And that's pretty standard. And so I would say that round up after X minutes will be 0 because we're always rounding up to the next increment if that's the case. Others may say, no, it's a 5-minute thing. After 5 minutes, then I round up to the next increment. So that would be that last field, the round up after X minutes. Okay, the defaults. These are the defaults you're going to set for you as a consultant. This way, when you create a new client, we're going to apply all these defaults to that client, and then you can just change them if necessary. Now, these are pretty similar to what the client already has, so they're pretty understandable. The hourly rate that you bill, whether or not you're a pre-bill, what the cutoff is, if they have a cutoff, the minimum number of hours that you bill, the billing increments, and then the round up after X minutes. So those are the defaults that would then get applied to the new clients. Okay. The next two tables are payments table. So this is where you've recorded that a client has paid you. So you say, okay, here's a client ID. That's the client. The number of hours they paid for, how much they paid for them, and what the date was. So the hours and amount may seem odd because we say we have an hourly rate. And so therefore, if you just said number of hours, that would tell you how much they paid. But sometimes people give discounts. So if you buy a block of, 10 hours, maybe you get the 11th for free. Okay. And so then just say you're at $10 an hour, which is ridiculously low. But $10 an hour, you bought 10 hours, you get the 11th for free. So you'd say they paid $100 and they got 11 hours. Okay. So that's why you have both. The other thing is if you change your hourly rate should probably change over time. So you want to see that was the old hourly rate and now here's the new hourly rate. And then finally the work column. This is what you actually did. Okay. So we design the user interface, we're going to have, I'll have this up on another monitor, but you might have it, if you wrote down a notepad, you'd have that notepad in front of you. If you wrote down a whiteboard, you'd have that whiteboard in front of you. And you design, you lay out your UI. And the same thing with database design, because having those things in front of you makes those steps really easy, and it allows you to think about the code and not have to worry about the design as much. Okay? So, well done. We've gotten through the planning steps. Notice that the planning stage isn't that long when you're designing a small application. The bigger the application, the larger the planning session should be. Okay? So we're doing a small application, small planning session. All right? So that's it for the planning process.